They say love finds you when you least expect it. But in the brutal winter of 1879, high in the Colorado Rockies, love found Jack Bear Morrison in the most unexpected way possible, through an act of defiance that should have killed the woman who refused his help. The snow was falling so thick that day, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, the kind of cold that turns spit to ice before it hits the ground. And there she stood, a young widow in a threadbare dress, her lips blue, her body shaking like an aspen leaf in a windstorm. Jack had seen death before. He'd seen men freeze to death on the frontier, watched the light leave their eyes as the cold claimed them. So when he offered her his fur-lined coat, the very coat that had kept him alive through 5 brutal winters in these mountains, he expected gratitude. He expected relief. What he got instead was a pair of fierce green eyes that burned with a fire hotter than any forge, and 2 words that would change both their lives forever. I refuse. Most men would have walked away. Most men would have shrugged and let pride be the death of her. But Jack Morrison wasn't most men. And Sarah McKenna wasn't most women. What happened next in that howling blizzard would become a legend whispered around campfires for generations. A story of stubborn pride, unexpected love, and the kind of courage that only blooms in the harshest conditions. But to understand why she refused that coat, and why that refusal sparked something in a man who'd sworn off human connection for good, we need to go back 3 days earlier, to when their paths first crossed in the dying mining town of Silver Ridge. Silver Ridge was dying, and everyone knew it. The silver had run out 2 years prior, and now the town clung to the mountainside like a stubborn mule refusing to accept its fate. Where once 3,000 souls had bustled through streets lined with saloons and supply stores, now barely 200 remained. Mostly those too poor to leave or too stubborn to admit defeat. Jack Morrison had been coming down from his mountain cabin once a month for supplies for the better part of 6 years. At 42, he was a man carved from the same granite as the peaks he called home, standing 6'4" with shoulders broad as an ox yoke. He wore a thick beard the color of iron, and his hands were scarred from a lifetime of surviving where softer men perished. His eyes, the gray of storm clouds, rarely met anyone else's. He liked it that way. The folks in Silver Ridge knew him as Bear, partly for his size, partly for the grizzly he'd killed with nothing but a hunting knife when he was 25, and partly because, like a bear, he was best left alone. He spoke only when necessary, conducted his business with quiet efficiency, and disappeared back into the wilderness before anyone could try to strike up conversation. That November afternoon, Jack was loading supplies onto his pack mule when he first noticed her. She emerged from the general store carrying a bag of flour that seemed to weigh nearly as much as she did. Unlike the other remaining townsfolk who'd grown gray and weathered, this woman couldn't have been more than 25. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a black dress that marked her as a widow, though the dress had been mended so many times it looked like a patchwork quilt. What caught Jack's attention wasn't her youth or her beauty, though she possessed both. It was the determined set of her jaw and the way she carried that flour sack without complaint, despite the strain evident in her slender arms. She walked past him without a glance, her worn boots crunching in the early snow that had begun to dust the streets. "That's Sarah McKenna," old Tom Brennan said, noticing Jack's gaze. Tom ran the livery and was one of the few people in town Jack tolerated. "Widow. Husband died in a mine collapse 8 months back. She's been running their claim by herself ever since." Jack grunted, which was about as conversational as he got. But Tom continued anyway. Tom always continued. "Stubborn as they come, that one. Her husband's brother came through last month, offered to take her back east to his family in Boston. She refused, said she'd made promises to her husband, and she meant to keep them. Been working that played-out claim ever since. Looking for a vein everyone knows ain't there. Won't accept charity neither. Widow Morrison tried to bring her a pot of stew last week. Sarah wouldn't take it unless she could trade eggs for it, even though everyone knows those chickens of hers are barely laying in this cold." Jack watched Sarah disappear into a small cabin at the edge of town, struggling with the flour sack until the very end. Something about the sight needled at him, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the familiar stubborn pride, He recognized it because he wore the same armor. Or perhaps it was the waste of it all. A young woman with her whole life ahead, slowly starving herself on a worthless claim out of loyalty to a dead man's dream. He shook his head and returned to his packing. Not his business. Not his problem. The mountain had taught him that survival meant focusing on yourself and nothing more. The moment you started caring about other people's troubles, you invited weakness. And weakness killed in the high country. But as Jack led his mule out of town that evening, heading back to his cabin before the storm everyone could feel coming, he found his eyes drifting to that cabin at the edge of Silver Ridge. Smoke curled from its chimney, thin smoke, the kind that came from burning wood sparingly because you were running low. A single candle glowed in the window. He turned away and headed up the mountain trail. The temperature was dropping fast, and he wanted to be home before the snow hit in earnest. Behind him, Silver Ridge faded into the gray afternoon light. He didn't look back. 3 days later, that storm would drive him back down the mountain. 3 days later, he would make an offer that would be refused. 3 days later, Jack Morrison would discover that sometimes the things you think will kill you are the very things that save you. But he didn't know that yet. The blizzard hit with the fury of a wounded beast. Jack had weathered hundreds of storms in his mountain cabin, but this one was different. This one was a killer. By the second day, the snow had piled 8 feet high against his cabin walls, and the temperature had plummeted to the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your lungs burn with every breath. On the morning of the third day, the wind finally died down enough for Jack to venture outside. He needed to check his traps and make sure his small barn hadn't collapsed under the snow's weight. His 2 mules and the mountain goat he kept for milk depended on him. It was while he was clearing snow from the barn entrance that he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the winter silence. Metal on stone. The rhythmic clank of a pickaxe striking rock. Jack stopped, listening. The sound was coming from the direction of town, but higher up, where the old mining claims scarred the mountainside. He frowned. No one would be fool enough to work a claim in this weather. The sound must be his imagination, or perhaps a tree branch scraping against stone in the wind. But the sound continued. Clank, 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 regular as a heartbeat, against his better judgment, and Jack would later reflect that his better judgment seemed to abandon him entirely where Sarah McKenna was concerned. He strapped on his snowshoes and headed toward the sound. The snow was still falling, thick and heavy, and visibility was almost zero. Another hour and he wouldn't be able to find his way back. He found her at the McKenna claim, a pitiful hole in the mountainside that should have been abandoned years ago. She was inside the shallow tunnel, swinging a pickaxe at the frozen rock face with methodical determination. She'd rigged a small lantern for light, and in its glow Jack could see that her hands were bleeding, her dress was frozen stiff, and her entire body was shaking with cold so violent it should have made swinging that pickaxe impossible. Yet she kept swinging. "Woman!" Jack's voice boomed into the tunnel, making her spin around. "Are you trying to kill yourself?" Sarah's green eyes flashed in the lantern light. Up close, he could see that her lips were blue, her face pale as death. Frost had formed on her eyelashes. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "Private property?" Jack couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "You'll be dead in an hour if you don't get warm. Come on." He started shrugging off his heavy fur coat, the one that had cost him 6 months' worth of pelts, the one lined with bearskin that trapped heat like nothing else existed. "I don't need your help." Sarah turned back to the rock face and swung the pickaxe again. Her arms were trembling so badly she could barely lift it. "The hell you don't." Jack moved closer, holding out the coat. "Put this on. Now." Sarah set down the pickaxe and turned to face him fully. Even half frozen and clearly dying, there was something magnificent in her defiance. "I said no. I don't accept charity from strangers or anyone else. If I can't survive on my own terms, then I don't deserve to survive at all." "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," Jack growled. "And I once knew a man who tried to fight a moose with his bare hands. Then leave. No one asked you to come here." She picked up the pickaxe again, but her hands were shaking so badly it fell from her grip, clattering on the stone floor. That's when Jack saw them, her hands. They weren't just bleeding. They were torn raw, the skin split open from the cold and the work. Some of the wounds looked infected. She'd wrapped them in strips of cloth that had once been white but were now stained dark with blood and dirt. Something shifted in Jack's chest. Something that felt uncomfortably like his long-dead heart cracking. This woman wasn't just stubborn. She was killing herself through sheer force of will, and for what? A worthless hole in the ground? Why? The word came out softer than he'd intended. Sarah met his eyes, and in them he saw something he recognized. The look of someone who'd lost everything and was holding on to the only thing they had left. Their pride. Because I promised my husband I'd make this claim work. Because everyone in Silver Ridge is waiting for me to fail, so they can say, I told you so. Because if I accept help, if I accept that I can't do this alone, then what was it all for? His death, my sacrifice, all of it. What was it for? Her voice broke on the last words, and Jack saw tears forming in her eyes. Tears that froze almost instantly on her cheeks. Let me tell you something about promises to dead men, Jack said quietly. They won't keep you warm at night. I refuse your coat, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her shaking. I refuse your pity. Now please leave. Jack stood there in the tunnel, holding his coat, looking at this impossible woman who would rather freeze to death than accept help. And that's when it happened. That's when he fell. Jack Morrison had survived 20 years in the mountains by knowing when to walk away. A bear acting aggressive? Walk away. A cliff face too unstable? Walk away. A mining tunnel starting to collapse? Walk away. Walking away had kept him alive when countless others had died. But looking at Sarah McKenna, shaking with cold and bleeding from her hands, while she clung to her pride like it was the only thing keeping her heart beating, Jack found he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Fine, he said, his voice rough. Keep your pride. But answer me this. What good is a promise to a dead man if you're dead too? That's my concern, not yours. Sarah's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely get the words out. Jack thought for a moment, an idea forming. It went against every instinct he'd developed, every rule he'd lived by. But sometimes survival meant adapting, and right now this woman needed to survive whether she wanted to admit it or not. A trade then, he said. Sarah's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What kind of trade? You're working this claim looking for silver, right? Looking for something valuable? When she nodded, Jack continued, I know these mountains better than any man alive. I know where the veins run, which rock formations indicate mineral deposits, which tunnels are worth digging and which are death traps. So I'll help you work this claim. I'll teach you what I know about reading the mountain. I'll provide proper equipment, show you safe mining techniques. He held up a hand before she could protest. In return, if we find anything, we split it 60-40 your favor. But more importantly, in return for my knowledge and labor, you accept basic provisions. Food, firewood, proper clothing. He gestured with the coat still in his hands. Starting with this. Sarah stared at him, and Jack could see her mind working, weighing her pride against her survival, testing the offer for any hint of charity. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I know you're fool enough to die in a worthless mine shaft rather than accept help, Jack said bluntly. I know you're working yourself to death on a claim that probably doesn't have enough silver to fill a tooth. And I know that you've got more courage than sense, which means if someone doesn't help you, this mountain will kill you, and I'm tired of this mountain taking people. The last words surprised him. He hadn't known he was going to say them, hadn't known he felt them until they emerged. But they were true. He was tired of it. Tired of finding frozen bodies every spring when the snow melted. Tired of marking graves for fools who didn't respect the mountain's power. 60-40, Sarah asked quietly. In your favor. It was your husband's claim. You've got rights to it. And you'd teach me? Really teach me? Not just do the work yourself. I teach you. Though I warn you, I'm not patient and I don't coddle. You'd have to work hard and learn fast. Sarah looked down at her bleeding hands, then at the pathetic scratch she'd made in the rock face. She'd been at it for months and had nothing to show for it but torn flesh and growing hunger. Jack could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Pride versus pragmatism, stubbornness versus survival. It wouldn't be charity, she said slowly, as if testing the words. It would be a business arrangement. A business arrangement, Jack confirmed. And you'd teach me everything? So eventually I could work it myself. Everything I know. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The lantern flickered, making shadows dance on the tunnel walls. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling like a living thing. The temperature was still dropping. Finally, she nodded. All right, we have a deal. She reached out to shake his hand, the way men sealed agreements. Jack took her hand carefully, mindful of her injuries. Her skin was ice cold, and he could feel her pulse racing too fast. A sign of hypothermia. They needed to get her warm immediately. Good. Now put on the damn coat. He draped it over her shoulders before she could protest. It swallowed her small frame, the hem dragging on the ground, but almost immediately he could see some tension leave her body as the retained heat seeped into her frozen skin. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet. I'm a hard taskmaster, and this mountain doesn't forgive mistakes. If we're partners, you do exactly what I say when it comes to safety. Understood. Sarah pulled the coat tighter around herself, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw her smile. Just a small one, but it transformed her face. Understood, partner. Jack nodded gruffly, trying to ignore the strange warmth spreading through his chest. Now let's get you back to town before we both freeze to death. We'll start properly tomorrow. As they emerged from the tunnel into the blinding snow, Jack realized that he'd just broken every rule he'd lived by for the past 6 years. He'd involved himself in someone else's life. He'd made a commitment that would tie him to another person. He'd opened himself up to caring what happened to someone. The mountain man had always been certain that caring was the first step toward dying. He just didn't know yet that sometimes it was the first step toward living. Over the next 3 weeks, Jack Morrison did something he hadn't done in years. He became part of someone else's life. Every morning before dawn, he'd trek down from his cabin to Silver Ridge, and every morning he'd find Sarah waiting at the claim entrance, ready to work despite the brutal cold. True to his word, Jack taught her everything. But he didn't make it easy. You're reading the rock wrong, he said on the 4th day, his voice gruff as Sarah examined a section of the tunnel wall. Look at the color variation. See that slight red tint? That's iron oxide. It sometimes travels with silver veins, but you need to follow it, not dig straight through it. Sarah studied the rock more carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. She'd proven to be a quick study, soaking up knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain. Her hands were healing too, thanks to the salve Jack had brought. Not as charity, he'd insisted, but as a necessary business expense. Can't have a partner who can't hold a pickaxe. There, she said, tracing a line with her finger. The coloring changes here, gets darker. Should we follow this direction? Good. You're learning. Jack moved closer to examine where she was pointing. But what else do you notice? Sarah looked again, and Jack could see her applying everything he'd taught her. The rock formation changes. The softer here, more crumbly. That could mean water damage. There's probably an underground spring running through this area. Dig here and you might flood the tunnel. We go around it. Jack marked the spot with chalk. The mountain's not just about finding silver. It's about reading the story the rock tells. Every stain, every crack, every layer. They all mean something. As the days passed, their partnership developed a rhythm. Jack would arrive at dawn and they'd work until midday, then break for the lunch Sarah insisted on providing. Simple fare of bread and beans, but she was adamant about contributing something. Afternoons were spent shoring up the tunnel with proper timber supports that Jack showed her how to construct, or clearing debris, or testing new sections of rock. But it wasn't just mining that Jack taught. He showed her how to read weather patterns in the clouds, how to find her way by the stars if she was ever caught out after dark, how to build a fire that would burn all night on minimal wood. He taught her which plants could be eaten and which would kill, how to tell if a snow bridge would hold her weight, how to listen to the mountain's warnings. "Why do you live up here alone?" Sarah asked one afternoon as they sat outside the tunnel, taking a break. The question surprised Jack. In 3 weeks, she'd never asked him anything personal. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the vista of snow-covered peaks stretching endlessly before them. "Got tired of people," he finally said. "That's not an answer." Jack glanced at her and found those green eyes studying him with the same intensity she applied to reading rock formations. She wasn't going to let it go. "Had a wife once," he said slowly, the words rusty from disuse, "and a daughter. This was 15 years back, down in Denver. I was working as a surveyor, mapping territories for the railroad. I was gone a lot, weeks at a time. One trip I came home and found them both dead. Cholera had swept through while I was away. By the time I got there, they'd been buried 3 days." Sarah's hand found his, her fingers wrapping around his scarred palm. She didn't say anything, just held on. And somehow that was better than any words could have been. "I couldn't." Jack paused, collecting himself. "I couldn't stay in that house, couldn't stay in that city. Everywhere I looked, I saw them. So I came here, built my cabin. Figured if I didn't let anyone get close, I couldn't lose anyone again. And then I came along and refused your coat," Sarah said softly. Jack huffed, something that might have been a laugh. "Yeah, then you came along. Most aggravating woman I've ever met. Refusing help like it's poison. Takes one to know one, Bear Morrison. You've been refusing human connection for 6 years. At least I was only trying to refuse a coat." She had him there. Jack found himself almost smiling. Something his face had nearly forgotten how to do. "Touché." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower toward the peaks. The cold was biting, but neither moved to leave just yet. "My husband's name was Thomas," Sarah said eventually. "Everyone thought he was foolish, chasing silver dreams. But he had such hope, such certainty that this claim would be our fortune. The day he died, he made me promise I'd keep trying. He said, 'Sarah, there's silver in this mountain, I know it. Promise me you'll find it.'" She paused, her voice thick. "I didn't know those would be his last words." "He shouldn't have asked you to promise that," Jack said quietly. "Maybe not, but I gave my word to a dying man. That means something." "It does," Jack agreed. "But you know what else means something? Living. He'd have wanted you to live." Sarah looked at him, and in her eyes Jack saw the same loneliness that he carried, the same grief that never quite healed. 2 wounded souls, trying to survive in an unforgiving wilderness. "Maybe we're both fools," she said. "Maybe we are," Jack replied. "But at least we're not freezing to death anymore." This time Sarah's laugh rang out clear and bright, echoing off the mountain walls. And Jack realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, his frozen heart had begun to thaw. 6 weeks into their partnership, on a morning when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at and the sun glinted off the snow like scattered diamonds, Sarah made the strike. Jack was in the back of the tunnel, testing a support beam, when he heard her gasp. He turned to find her staring at the rock face she'd been working, her pickaxe frozen mid-swing. "Bear," she said, her voice strange. "Bear, I think you need to see this." He moved to her side, bringing his lantern closer. There, exposed by her last swing, was a vein of silver running through the rock. But this wasn't the thin, worthless traces they'd found before. This was substantial, for inches wide at least, and from what Jack could see in the lamplight, it ran deep into the mountain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stared at the gleaming metal, proof that Thomas McKenna's dream hadn't been foolish after all. "Is it?" Sarah couldn't finish the question. Jack pulled out his knife and scraped at the vein, testing it. Pure silver fell away in shavings. "It's real, and if I'm reading this right, this vein's going to run for at least another 20 feet, maybe more." He looked at Sarah, seeing the shock and disbelief written across her face. "You did it. You found your husband's silver." Sarah's legs seemed to give out, and she sat down hard on a pile of rocks, still staring at the vein. "I can't believe it." After all this time, all those months of finding nothing, you kept your promise to him, Jack said quietly. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, but she was smiling. We did it. She looked up at Jack. This is your success too. Without you, I'd have died in this tunnel weeks ago, still digging in all the wrong places. Jack shook his head. This was always your claim, your victory. No. Sarah stood up, wiping her eyes. We're partners, remember? 60-40. That was the deal. Over the next 3 weeks, they carefully extracted the silver, and with each day's haul, it became clear that this wasn't just a good strike. It was a fortune. The vein kept going, wider and deeper than Jack had initially estimated. By the time they reached the end of it, they'd pulled out enough silver to make Sarah wealthy and Jack comfortable for life. Word spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire. The dying town suddenly had hope again. If the McKenna claim could still produce, maybe others could too. Prospectors started returning. Merchants began reopening their shops. Sarah McKenna had single-handedly revived Silver Ridge. But wealth brought complications. You should head back east, Jack said one evening as they sat in Sarah's cabin, counting the day's take. A woman alone with this kind of money, you'd be safer in a city. You could have a proper house, society, everything you gave up when you came west. Sarah looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Is that what you want? For me to leave? The question hit Jack harder than he'd expected. Over the past 2 months, his life had transformed. He no longer spent days in silence. He looked forward to dawn because it meant seeing Sarah. His cabin felt empty when he returned to it each night. The solitude he'd once craved now felt like a prison. What I want doesn't matter, he said gruffly. It matters to me. 3 words. Simple words. But they hung in the air between them like a confession. Jack met her eyes and saw his own truth reflected there. Somewhere between that first refusal in the snow and this moment, they'd fallen in love. Not the quick passion of youth, but something deeper. The kind of love built through shared work and quiet understanding. Through teaching and learning. Through 2 wounded souls finding unexpected healing in each other. Sarah, he started, but she stood up, crossing the small cabin to where he sat. You told me once that promises to dead men won't keep you warm at night, she said. I've kept my promise to Thomas. I found his silver. But now I'm alive, and I get to make choices for the living. She took a deep breath. I'm choosing to stay. I'm choosing this mountain. I'm choosing you, if you'll have me. Jack stood, his large hands gently cupping her face. I'm not an easy man. I'm rough and I'm gruff, and I've been alone so long I barely remember how to be with people. Good thing I'm not people then. I'm your partner. Sarah smiled. And for what it's worth, I'm stubborn and I'm proud, and I refuse perfectly good coats in blizzards. We're quite a pair. That we are. Jack agreed, and then he kissed her, pouring 6 years of loneliness and 2 months of growing love into it. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle this time. The mountain that had taken so much from both of them had given them something back, each other. But the story wasn't quite finished. Because sometimes happiness, once found, needs to be fought for. And sometimes the mountain has one last test to offer. Spring came to Silver Ridge with the roar of melting snow and the promise of renewal. Jack and Sarah had married in a simple ceremony at the edge of winter, witnessed by the entire town. They were building a new cabin together, something bigger than either of their old places, situated halfway between the mine and Jack's old territory. A compromise like everything in their relationship. But on the first day of May, when the wildflowers were just beginning to push through the thawing earth, trouble arrived on horseback. His name was Raymond McKenna, Thomas's older brother. He'd come once before, months ago, offering to take Sarah back east. Now he'd returned, and he wasn't alone. He'd brought a lawyer and documents showing that as Thomas's only living relative, he had legal claim to Thomas's estate, including the mine. The claim was filed in my brother's name, Raymond explained, sitting in Sarah's, now Sarah and Jack's, cabin. He was a thin man with a pinched face and calculating eyes. Since you and Thomas had no children, And since mining law requires the claimant to be the active operator, which as a woman you legally cannot be, the claim reverts to the family estate. Which means it reverts to me. The lawyer beside him nodded, spreading papers across the table. It's all quite legal, I assure you, Mrs. McKenna can contest it in court, of course, but given the precedents and the expenses involved. How much? Jack asked quietly. He'd been standing by the fireplace, silent until now. Raymond's eyes gleamed. I beg your pardon? How much money would it take for you to sign the claim over to Sarah permanently and disappear back east? Bear, no, Sarah started, but Jack held up a hand. The man wants money. That's all this is about. So let's talk numbers. Raymond smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Well, given the production reports I've heard, I'd say the claim is worth at least $50,000. But family sentiment being what it is, I might be persuaded to accept $30,000 and relinquish all claims. It was extortion, plain and simple. $30,000 was nearly everything they'd made from the mine. It would leave them with enough to live on, but barely. The dream of real security would be gone. Sarah stood abruptly. Get out. Mrs. McKenna, I understand you're upset, but the law. Sarah's voice was shaking, but not with fear, with fury. Your brother died in that mine. I nearly died in that mine. We pulled silver from rock with our bare hands. We fought this mountain for every ounce. And you, sitting comfortable in Boston, want to take it all because of a legal technicality. It's not a technicality, it's the law, the lawyer said primly. Sarah turned to Jack, and in her eyes he saw the same fire that had made her refuse his coat in the blizzard. We could fight this, take it to court. We'd lose, Jack said bluntly. He's right about the law. Mining claims are tricky when it comes to widows' rights. So we just give up? Let him take everything. Jack looked at Raymond McKenna, seeing the greed and smugness there. He thought about Sarah working herself to death in that tunnel. He thought about Thomas McKenna's last words, making his wife promise to find silver. He thought about the past 3 months, the happiest of his life. And then Jack Morrison did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He laughed. What's so funny? Raymond demanded. You, Jack said, still chuckling. You and your lawyer and your papers. See, you're right about one thing, the claim was in Thomas's name. And yes, there are complications about transferring it to a widow. He pulled out a folded document from his pocket. But there's no complications about transferring it to a partner. He spread the paper on the table. It was the partnership agreement he and Sarah had drawn up that first day, properly notarized and filed with the territorial office. Sarah McKenna owns 60% of the mine's production, but I, Jack Morrison, am listed as the primary operator and 40% partner. That makes me the legal claimant under mining law. And I've got 6 years of established claims in this territory, all properly filed and maintained. The lawyer leaned forward, reading the document, and his face fell. This is legitimate. Damn right it is, Jack said. So here's what's going to happen. You and Mr. McKenna here are going to get back on your horses and ride back east. And if we ever see you in Silver Ridge again, I'll have the sheriff arrest you for harassment and attempted fraud. Raymond's face had gone red. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Sarah said firmly. My husband wanted this mine to succeed, wanted us to have a future. I've honored that promise. But I'm not going to let you dishonor his memory by stealing what we built. Now get out of my house. After they left, Sarah collapsed into a chair, shaking. Jack knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. You saved us, she whispered. We saved each other, Jack corrected. That's what partners do. Sarah pulled him close, and they stayed that way for a long time, holding each other while outside the spring wind whispered through the pines and the mountain looked on, impassive and eternal. The test had come and they'd passed. Not through surrender, not through force, but through the same thing that had brought them together in the first place. The stubborn refusal to give up, even when the odds seemed impossible. 20 years later, folks still talked about Bear Morrison and his wife Sarah. Their mine had produced for another 5 years before finally playing out. But by then they didn't need it anymore. They'd used their earnings to start a supply company that outfitted prospectors across 3 territories. Sarah had a head for business that surprised everyone except Jack, who'd known from the start that the woman who'd refused his coat in a blizzard could do anything she set her mind to. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, all of whom learned to read the mountain from their father and inherited their mother's stubborn pride. The youngest daughter would eventually become the first woman to file a mining claim in her own name in Colorado Territory. But that's a story for another time. The cabin they built together still stands halfway up the mountain, expanded over the years into a sprawling homestead. And on winter nights, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls like a living thing, travelers sometimes stop there, drawn by the warm lights and the promise of shelter. Sarah always welcomes them in, feeds them, offers them a place by the fire. And sometimes, if the travelers seem particularly lost or stubborn or proud, Jack will tell them the story of how they met, how a young widow refused a coat in the snow, and how that refusal changed 2 lives forever. Love finds you when you least expect it, he always says, his arm around Sarah's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. But sometimes you have to be brave enough to refuse the easy path. Sometimes you have to nearly freeze to death before you learn to accept warmth. And sometimes the mountain takes everything from you so it can give you something better. The travelers always leave the next morning with full bellies and warm coats. Coats that Sarah insists they take, that Jack insists aren't charity but basic human decency. Most accept, but every now and then someone refuses. And when they do, Sarah and Jack just smile at each other, remembering a blizzard and a tunnel and the moment when 2 stubborn souls found each other in the cold. Some promises are worth keeping, some refusals are worth making, and some love stories are worth waiting for, even if it takes a mountain and a blizzard and nearly freezing to death to make them happen. The mountain knows. The mountain always knows.